Hello and welcome to the 13th chapter of the course. In this chapter, we will be looking at final table ICM, both as the covered stack but also as the covering stack. We will be looking at some different tournaments and different scenarios and trying to draw some conclusions from that. The main things that we mentioned during the bubble ICM chapter are still true here. So the short stacks have to be jamming very, very tight because they have a reduced fold equity. But at the same time, the big stacks also have to jam a bit tighter and generally just play a little bit tighter because the short stacks have a lower risk premium, therefore they can stack up wider. So same concepts, but a bit different, and we're going to see why right away. The first spot that we have is this one with pocket threes. Again, there is no limping during ICM. I will have a hand where I included limps as well, and you will see that it's just not a thing. So, pocket threes, what do we have here? This is a 530 PSKO tournament with 79 players, and we are 6 left at the moment. The starting bounty is 125, and the starting stack here would be 50k. So a starting bounty would be worth around 40% of the starting stack, so around 20k, or a bit less than one big blind. It falls to me on the cutoff, and we can see the button has 19 big blinds and a fairly large bounty. Small blind has 30 big blinds and a fairly large bounty, and the big blind has 2 starting bounties and 17 big blinds. The first thing we want to look at is how big are the bounties in terms of chips, how much are they worth? So the button has 1,093, and the starting bounty is 125. So this is about 8.5 starting bounties. So we said the starting bounty is worth about 20k, so this is worth about 160k, maybe a bit more, like 170, which in turn is worth about 7-ish big blinds. The small blind has 843, which is worth about 7 starting bounties, which in turn is worth about 140k, which is around like 7 big blinds or 6 big blinds. Yeah, 5.5 to 6 big blinds. And the big blind has 2 starting bounties, so worth about 40k or 1.5 big blinds. Okay, so do we have jams here? Let's have a look. We are the cutoff, and we can see that we have almost no jams. Even though we cover everyone and there is some risk premium, some ICM on them, and a relatively high risk premium, just to have a look at the risk premiums, you can see here the button has 10%, small blind has 13, and the big blind has 10. So yes, they have a risk premium, but it's not high enough where we can be jamming a lot. After we jam, the button can call 8 plus, ace jack, ace 9 suited, small blind, similar range, and the big blind calls much wider because he's a shorter stack and also closes the action. So the positions behind can call fairly wide, therefore we just don't really get to jam. We get to raise a very wide kind of range, of course, because we can really get played back too much. As we said, short stacks can really jam because they have reduced fold equity, but they can stack up wide against jams. So after we open, we can see the button is playing like this. So he jams basically close to the same range he can call our jam with. We also see a few calls, even though he only has 19 big blinds. We can see he still gets to have some calls with strong suited hands. Small blind looks like this, so some non-all-in free betting, not much, but some suited aces and top range, jamming a lot of the middle part, and big blind gets to jam a lot. The reason the big blind gets to jam so much is because his bounty isn't worth that much. And of course, again, he has no players behind. So because the big blind's bounty isn't very relevant, he gets to attack our super wide opening range by jamming a lot. So any pocket pair, any ace-x, suited aces, king, queen off. Because against him, we have to call a range that looks like this. So still calling somewhat wide, but we have to fold a lot. And this is something that we need to keep in mind. In PKOs, generally, the ranges will be much wider. You can see the big blind gets to jam like pocket deuces and ace 5 off, and we get to call off with ace 7 off for the 17 big blind stack size that jams. If the button ends up jamming instead, a range that looks like this, then we get to call very, very wide. And we can see a very big difference in how our calling range looks like. So because the big blind is jamming a lot of offsuit ace-6 and pocket pairs, then what happens is that we don't really want to call many suited connected hands. We instead want to call a lot of ace-6 ourselves because we call ace-8 off and we dominate a lot of his jams. Now, against the button, though, the button doesn't jam offsuit ace-6 that much. As we can see, it doesn't really jam many pocket pairs either. So against the button, we want to be calling a very different kind of range. You can see we're folding a lot with our ace-6 because it's just dominated and doesn't do well against the jamming range. But we call a lot with suited hands. You can see always 9-8 suited, 10-8 suited, jack-8 suited, king-6 suited, and so on. Because suited hands just perform better. We can also see a hand like king-6 suited and king-7 suited are calling, but ace-6 and ace-7 suited are folding. Because king-7 suited is doing better against the range that looks like this. It's just not dominated as much. King-7 is dominated by king-queen, ace-king, and kings, whereas a7 suited is dominated by all these like ace-10, ace-jack, ace-queen off, which is way more combos. So this is definitely something that we should keep in mind in these PSKO tournaments and just make sure to call the appropriate range against the range we're up against. Against very wide ranges that include a lot of offsuit ace-6, we want to call high cards. Against tighter ranges, we want to call more suited connected stuff. Okay, so next up, we have this same spot with pocket threes. But first thing I did was allow limping to see if anyone wants to limp. I already kind of spoiled this for you. I told you that there is no limping. But you can also see it here. So under the gun, 0 limps. Under the gun, 1 hijack, so 0 limps. Cutoff, 0 limps. Button, 0 limps. So no one is limping here. No one. As for the opening ranges, we should have a look at how the other position is supposed to play as well. So under the gun is one of the shorter stacks, but he has a 0 or starting bounty, which is worth almost nothing. So because of that, he actually gets to open a very wide kind of range. You can see he's opening around 21% of hands. Because of how small his bounty is, there is not much incentive for players behind to play back. For example, against his open, if we look at the cutoff range, it looks like this. So not much rebetting, and yes, we call a bunch, but we don't call super wide. Reminder, what we said about the big stack, calling a lot and not 3-betting a lot in PSKOs is true in ICM just as it was true in Chip EV. We can see the big stack here doesn't 3-bet much. 3-bet's a very strong value range, and offsuit ace-6 is the majority of our bluffing range, calling pocket pairs, suited connectors, suited ace-6, and so on. The big blind against this type of range also gets to defend fairly tight. We can see jack-10 off is folding, a lot of suited hands are folding. And the reason is that basically it's a fairly tight range, and the big blind just cannot really realize a lot of equity and will just be way too dominated with these kind of hands. As for the big blind's risk premium against under the gun, if we look at this, it is 7.6%. So it's not super high, but because of how tight the opening range is, and because of this 7.6% risk premium, the defending range just has to be very limited. Now, the hijack, who is the shortest stack on the table, he's the one with 13 big blinds and has 3.5 starting bounties, which is like 70k or around 3 big blinds, has to play very, very tight. The 3.5 big blind bounty is a fairly big number in relation to his stack, so he just has to be very, very careful. We can see he gets to have some jumps, not many, even though it's only a 13 blind stack. The jamming is very limited, and the raising range is also very, very tight. You can see king jack off is not raising, even like queen 10 suited, jack 10 suited are very, very break even. Low suited ace-6 are also just folding. In an open PSKO final table, these hands would just be opening a lot, and we would also have a few more jumps, but because it's the PSKO, we just need to be more careful. Against the hijack min raise, the way we get to play our big stack on the cutoff is extremely call heavy. So because the opening range is very, very tight, and the stack size is very small, we just don't really have 3-bet folds here. So because of that, we just develop this very wide calling range. You can see kings, aces, we want to be calling and trapping, and this also allows us then to call very wide with suited connected hands. You can see Jack 8 suited, 6-4, 8-6, 9-7, King 5 suited, every pocket pair, even Queen Jack off, King Jack off, Ace 10 off. So we definitely get to call a very wide range against the very tight opening range because of the bounty and how relevant it is compared to his stack size. If we look at our risk premium, so cutoff against the hijack is at minus 7.9%. So we can see that because of that, we're just allowed to VPIP very, very wide against the opening range. As for jamming, we jam some suited broadways, jacks, ace queen, ace king off, some ace 5, ace 4 suited. Not much, but a fairly well-defined kind of range. The button gets to play like this, so the button has to be a bit more careful. And the problem is that there is the risk of getting squeezed behind when the button calls. When we call from the cutoff, the risk of squeeze is much more limited because we cover everyone by quite a margin, so they just can't really play back much. For example, the button can only jam a very linear tight range, and same goes for the small blind. We can see not much squeezing going on. The big blind, of course, follows the same idea. Gets to defend very tight and not squeeze much. On the contrary, when it's the button that calls, who is the shortest stack with the big bounty, then the risk of getting squeezed is much, much higher. We can see the small blind is much more aggressive. And yeah, the big blind, not so much, but the small blind is definitely more aggressive. The big blind is covered by the button. So if the button was calling as much as the cutoff, then you can imagine that the small blind would be all in with like any two suited hands, any blocker as well. So because of that, the button can call a very limited range and wants to play more of a 3-betting range. Also worth pointing out, the button doesn't have any jams. Even though he only has 19 big blinds, because the hijack's range is so tight, there is no jams from the button. And this is a very common concept in ICM situations, not only in PSKO ICM, but ICM in general, where against very tight ranges, we don't really want to have jams. And yeah, you can see this very clearly. The button plays 0 jams with 19 blinds against the 13 big blind open because of how tight it is. The small blind against the open gets to play like this, so gets to get it in with any pocket pair, suited aces, suited broadways. Seems very reasonable. And then the big blind gets to defend a lot. So even though the big blind is up against a very tight range, now the big blind covers, so he gets to defend much, much wider than against under the gun when the big blind was covered. So any offsuit ace-x, any offsuit connected hands, of course, everything suited. And for jamming, we go with pocket pairs and suited aces. We talked about how the cutoff gets to play. So if the cutoff folds, how does the bottom play? Who is the, I guess, shortish stack with the big bounty. He gets to raise a very, very tight range, only 24%, because the small blind covers him. But there are no jumps. No jumps at all. Against the raise, small blind gets to jam super, super wide. So against the 24% range, the small blind jams like 21%. The reason is that the small blind's risk premium against the bottle is minus 9.2, which is really, really high. Therefore, anything half decent just has the equity to get it in against the opening range. This is definitely something we should be aware of, especially when it's likely people open a bit wider than that. Like, would the button fold like a6 off in reality, or like king 5 suited, or pocket 5s? Probably not. It depends on the player, of course, but probably not. So against the wider range, we should be even wider. You can see even like 10-9 off and king 9 off are jamming. So basically against wide-ish late position opens, when the bounty is relevant, here as we said, it's worth around 8.5 big blinds, and the stack size is 19, we just get to jam super, super aggressively. Against the jam, the bottom gets to call like 7s plus, ace 10 off, ace 8 suited, king jack suited. Yep, seems reasonable. If the small blind folds, the big blind gets to play like this. So because the big blind is covered, he doesn't get to jam anywhere close to as much as the small blind. Jumps pocket pairs, some suited broadways, ace jack, ace queen, ace king off. These are the main hands. And also doesn't get to defend very wide. Again, there is no incentive for the big blind to defend here, because he's covered, and he's up against a fairly tight range, 24%. So we can see the defending range is just going to be very tight, And the response is going to be very similar to what we saw against Under the Gun, because the opening range is very similar too. Under the Gun was opening like 21%, and the bottom is opening 24%. So even though it's two very different positions, our responses will be very similar against them because of the similarity in the opening range percentage. Finally, what about blind versus blind? So just a reminder about the stacks, small blind has 30 and big blind has 17 with a fairly small bounty. Now here, what happens is what we said, that in the PSKO ICM final table, the cover stacks and stack are fairly wide, so then the bigger stack on the small blind can't jump too aggressively. You can see the main jumps are going to be offsuit ace-x, lowest pocket pairs, and middling suited hands, as well as some middling offsuit ones. We don't get to jam a hand like, say, I don't know, 6-4 off or 5-4 off. These hands are losing money as jumps. The worst suited hands are probably slightly profitable, like 10 deuce makes a little bit, 9 deuce loses a little bit, but they perform a lot better as limps. If this was a non-PSKO final table, we wouldn't really see limps from the small blind. However, here, because the risk premium from the big blind is pretty small, big blind against small blind is only 8.3%, whereas in a normal final table it would be like 14, 15 maybe, something like that. The small blind just doesn't get to jump much. Against the small blind jam, the big blind is calling 21%, so very wide. We call ace-5 off, king-10 off, king-9 suited, pocket fives. Against the raising range, which is going to be, again, like the best hands and the worst hands, for the most part, the big blind gets to play like this, so jam a very linear kind of range, trap top range, and still call fairly tight, folding a bunch of suited stuff, queen 8 off, queen 7 off, king 6 off, and so on. Finally, against the small blind limp, the big blind plays like this. So, first, the jams, fairly limited, mostly offsuit ace-x and pocket pairs. The ISOs are also very, very limited. So we can see a very big difference here between a normal GPV situation and this, where we ISO top range and a very limited bottom range and worst hands we have. We don't see any like king 7 off, queen 8 off that we usually see at these stack sides. It's just a much, much more polar kind of ISO range. Okay, so I think with that, we can move on to the next hand. And the next hand will be from the same tournament over here. So we are still 6 players left. The stack size have changed slightly, but still a bunch of shorter stacks. We are the bigger stack, and now we are under the gun. So what we want to see is, first, do we have jumps? Second, how wide should we be opening, and how do people get to play behind? Here we go. So jumps, no, 0. Again, 0 jumps, even though there are 3 very short stacks and 2 middling stacks. We would have a lot of jumps than on PSKO, but not in the PSKO tournament. We get to open fairly wide, 36%. Against that, hijack plays almost no calls, jumps a bunch, and 3-bets a bunch, calls very, very little. The cutoff, very similar response. The button doesn't really have calls with 14 big blinds, just wants to jam a fairly linear, wide kind of range. Small blind, same, no calls, and the big blind gets to defend very, very wide. So basically, we need to remember that their risk premium is low, which is why they just get to jam fairly wide against our already wide opening range. Now, how wide do we get to call? And this just depends a lot on the bounties. So the hijack has the biggest bounty. As we said, this was about 8.5 standing bounties, so around 160, 170k. Here, the big blind is 30k, so like 6-ish big blinds, 5.5. Therefore, against this jam, we have to call fairly tight, because it's a 24 big blind jam and the bounty is worth like 5, so not too much. Against the cutoff, similar story. Against the jam, we have to call very tight. Now, against the button, so the button gets to jam wider, but his bounty is also quite a bit smaller. Still, because of the wideness of his range, we get to call much, much wider against that as well. Against the small blind, who still has the starting bounty, he gets to jam a range but looks like this, so 17%, and we call again fairly wide. Not too wide because of the starting bounty, but yeah, still we're just not having a high risk premium at all. You can see that our risk premium against the small blind is basically zero. So we're playing a GPV kind of calling range. And against the big blind, we are calling super wide because the big blind is the shortest stack with a relatively large bounty. So even though the big blind is jamming very tight, as we can see much tighter on the small blind, we can call very, very wide. We're folding only the worst offsuit hands that we have. Finally, let's have a look at how we play against no all-in 3-bets. So first, what if the hijack with a 24 big blind 3-bets us has the big bounty? How wide do we get to continue? And the answer is very, very wide, especially with suited hands. We really like suited hands against 3-bets because we can just flop a flush draw and get it in happily. So you can see we're not really folding almost anything suited. As for jumps, it's the usual suited ace-x and top range, like knights plus. Against the cutoff 3-bet range, we play fairly similar. Again, not really folding suited stuff and jamming a similar kind of range construction. So the main takeaways from this one would be that we get to open very wide, but we can't really call these all-ins that wide because their jamming range will be fairly tight and the bounties aren't really worth too much. Against 3-bets, we don't really fold suited connected hands, and how tight or how wide our opponent jam on us depends on their bounty. So it's of a small blind, has a starting bounty, gets to jump fairly wide. The big blind, even though he's closing the action, because he has 10.5 big blinds and 3.5 starting bounties, he just cannot be jamming as wide as the small blind because we just don't really get to fold almost anything. Okay, and the final hand from this tournament that I want to look at is this King 5 offsuit. So now we're at 5 players left. Failed us, knocked the other player out, and we're still distributing stack, and it folds to us on the small blind. The big blind has the same stacks, the same kind of bounty that we spoke about. He hasn't really increased it at all. So our question is, how wide can we jam here? Should we raise much? Should we jam much? Should we limp anything? How are we supposed to play? And the answer is because of how large the bounty is. We said it's worth about 7 big blinds. Well, it was 8.5 now, but the blinds increased. It's around 7. We get to jam a lot. Offsuit ace-x, suited connected hands, offsuit connected hands, even some offsuit king-x. We still want to raise a lot with top range and bottom range, but jam a lot of the middling stuff. Now, we don't really get to limp, and we don't really get to fold. A lot of these suited connected hands, we just get to raise call, like 10-9 suited, Jack-10 suited. And the reason is that we perform very well when our opponent calls, and if he jams, we're still getting the odds to call no. We can see that we're not really folding. Even like Queen-9 off, we get to raise call. Now, I think drawing the line between like, okay, we raise call Queen-9, but we raise fold King-9 is going to be pretty tough. So I think jamming these hands is fine and just raise calling the suited ones that play really well post-flop. Against our jam, the big blind gets to call really, really wide, ace-5 off plus, king-9 off, pocket 5s, because his risk premium is just not that high and he's up against a super wide range. You can see 11% risk premium and a jamming range of just no good hands, basically. So yeah, ace-6 really good, suited, strong hands, king-9 off, very linear, high card heavy kind of range. Okay, on to the next one. So the next spot that I want to look at would be, I think, this one. This is a very good spot to have a look at. This is another final table of a PSKO, and we are 6 players left. We are 5th. So the starting bounty here would be 250. So we have like close to 5 starting bounties. The starting stack is 25k. So a starting bounty here would be worth maybe around 11k. We have about 5. So about 55k. Or about 7 big blinds. We have an open from the bottom who is covered by the big blind but covers us. And so the question here is, how wide does the button get to open and how wide can we jam against that? It should be clear at this point that we just want to jam a very linear, value heavy kind of range. We don't really want to have too many bluffs, but where do we draw the line? First, the button gets to open fairly wide, 43.5%. Again, he's incentivized to open wide against us because we are very short with a very big bounty, but he's incentivized to open tight against the big blind who covers him because the button himself also has a big bounty. So against this range, we get to play like this. So this is very, very, very tight kind of range. I thought ace-3 suited was close in game, but we can see it's not even like remotely close. Ace-9 suited, we'd rather call than jam. So why do we go so tight? Well, because we just don't really have fold equity. If we jam, the button gets to call almost any two cards, and the big blind gets to call a lot as well. So because they just don't really fold a lot, we have to be very tight and very careful with the hands we jam. We can't even jam like Jack 10 suited, Queen 10 suited, 6s we don't jam, 5s, Ace-3 suited, and so on. Again, this is a very different scenario from a normal non-PSKO tournament. In the vanilla tournaments, we would be jamming a lot here because the button just isn't incentivized to get in against us. Now that we have the big bounty, we just have to be super, super tight. If we call, the big blind gets to play like this, so squeeze a lot, jam a lot, very linear kind of range, fold close to 0. And after the big blind squeeze, we just don't really fold much from a small blind. We only fold like Queen Jack suited, King 10 suited. If we fold the small blind, the big blind plays like this against the button, so no jumps, and 3-bets a fairly polar range. We can see top range and then complete garbage. And again, just doesn't really fold much. The big blind doesn't get to fold against the button because on one hand, the button's range is very wide. On the other hand, the big blind covers him and the button has a significant bounty, so the big blind's equity realization post-flop will be much wider. So from this one, I think we have 3 very interesting takeaways, which is first, when the button wants to raise wide because of one stack but tight because of the other, he ends up playing a fairly middling kind of raising frequency around 40%. Second, the cover stack with a large bounty in this case just gets to play super, 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 super tight because both players will get it in very wide against us. And the big blind, being the covering stack, just doesn't really fold much against the button. Next hand is, let's look at this one. So kind of a similar spot as before. We are the source stack on a final table. So here, the starting bounty is 125. So we have maybe 5 or close to 6 around that. And the starting stack is 25k. So a bounty would be worth around 11k here. So if we have around 6, then that's around 60k, about 2 big blinds. So what happens here is, on one hand, yes, it is a bit of a similar spot. On the other hand, though, we have a few key differences. The main key difference, or the first one, is that our bounty is worth significantly less than before. Before we had 13 blinds and our bounty was worth more than half of that. Now we have 22 and our bounty is worth like 2 big blinds. The other main difference is that now the button is covered by the small blind, but the big blind doesn't have a big bounty, so he's not really incentivized to open wide at all here. One stack covers him, the other stack has a small bounty, so just no real reason for him to open wide. So what we want to look at here is how wide should the button open, how much can the small blind call, and how should we react against a raise and a call. Okay, first, the button. We can see opening 37.8%. So not too tight, but definitely not wide either. 37%, 37.8 for a button range is fairly tight. Against this range, the small blind gets to call a lot. So a few very interesting things here. First, no jams for the small blind at all. Again, this is something that we see just so much in those PSKO final tables. Because of the lower risk premium of the cover stacks, the big stacks just cannot be jamming much. So what we see is a very call-heavy range, calling suited connectors, suited kings, suited aces, and also 3-betting very, very aggressively to a non-all-in sizing. For value, very wide, 7s plus ace-jack, ace-10 suited, and for bluffs like every single offsuit ace-x that isn't a profitable call, as well as even like king 8 off, queen 10 off, low suited queens, low suited kings. One way to construct this range would be to think about the strongest hands that we have to fold or the weakest hands that cannot be calling. For example, ace 9 is a pretty good call. But a hand like a6, a7, these hands aren't profitable calls. The a7 you can see is losing like $4 a call, so instead goes into our 3-bet range. Same goes with a lot of these hands. A queen 5 suited is losing a bit as a call, so instead goes into the 3-bet range. Same for king 2 suited. When the small blind calls, the big blind gets to play like this. So because our bounty isn't worth much, and because the small blind calls a very wide range, we can actually jump very aggressively here. Well, not very, but fairly aggressively. 6s plus, a lot of these suited broadways and suited 9x. And then, of course, ace 10 off plus, king queen off, a lot of these hands that feel very natural. We're also getting to overcall and defend very, very wide. You can see both suited and offsuit wise. Against our jam, the button is calling 7s plus, ace 10 suited ace jack. So very tight range because our bounty is worth close to nothing. And if the button folds, the small blind is calling 6s, 7s, some ace 10 off, king jack suited. Calls a bit, but mostly folds because of how wide his range is. So I think it's very crucial to be able to differentiate between the two spots. On one, we want to be super, super tight. On the other one, we can actually be fairly aggressive. Now, if the small blind 3-bets against the button, we get to play like this from the big blind. So again, jamming very aggressively, suited broadways, king queen off, ace jack off. Because our bounty is worth nothing, the small blind will still fold a lot against our jam. If the small blind 3-bets and the big blind folds, the button gets to continue like this. So not much calling. As we know, in ICM situations, we don't really want to be calling 3-bets, and this is true here as well. So you can see it's mostly jamming, some very specific suited strong hands calling. Finally, if after the button opens the small blind folds, we get to play the big blind like this. So defending fairly tight. We can see now we actually defend tighter than if the small blind hand called, because when the small blind calls, we are getting better odds. We are in position of one of the 3 players, or one of the other 2 players, we're in position of the small blind. And yeah, we're just up against one wide range who is super capped. Whereas against the button, we're up against one range, getting worse odds, and we're out of position. Okay, next up, we have this spot over here. So this is, of course, again, a final table. The starting stack here is 50,000 and the starting bounty is 250. So we have about 9 starting bounties. We said the starting stack is 50k, so at this point the starting bounty would be worth around 20k, 22 maybe. So we have 9, which is about 180k, 190k, which would be worth about 2.5 big blinds, because the big blind is 80,000. So we are short 13 big blinds, and our bounty is worth about 2.5, not that much. The question is, how wide do we get to open here, and how much do we get to jam? So this is a spot where we just have to play super tight. You can compare this to the under the gun range that we saw in the previous final table, where his bounty was small, so he was able to open very wide because he had like 20 blinds and his bounty was worth like 2. Now we have 13 and our bounty is worth 2.5 or so. Therefore, we have to be super, super careful and super tight. We get to jam 8 plus, 8 through queens, and king queen suited, king jack suited, ace queen off, ace king off. And we can't even raise king 10 suited, queen jack suited comfortably. These are just completely marginal break-even kind of opens. Against our jam, the players behind have to be fairly careful, but overall they are reasonable kind of ranges. The bigger their stack, the more they get to call. For example, the hijack has 100 big blinds, gets to call us fairly wide, whereas the cutoff has 11 big blinds, has to call super tight, he doesn't even cover us. The button has to call very tight as well, and so on. Against our min raise, what happens is that we actually end up getting called a lot. So yes, we open fairly tight, but we also have like suited aces and king 10 suited, ace jack off in our range. So because of that, the guy next to us, we can see is calling pocket pairs and suited broadways. The hijack, who is the big stack with 100 big blinds, is calling ridiculously wide. 5-2 suited, queen 3 suited, 10-6 suited, like king 10 off. So not much free betting, very, very little free betting, but a super wide calling range. Just to have a better visual, we have 13 and he has 108. So he gets to call super, super, super wide. He has basically no ICM pressure at all against us. And because of our bounty, his risk premium is at, we're MP1, right? Yeah, it's at minus 11.9%. So he's just super incentivized to call us wide. We can see just super, super, super wide calling range. And I think this is one of the main takeaways from this whole ICM thing, that big stacks don't free bet, big stacks call. People do this wrong a lot. We just get to call as a big stack. That's our play. That's how we make our money. The cutoff gets to jump very, very tight. We're opening a super tight range already, so when he's covered and has almost no fold equity, has to play a very, very tight range. The button with 30 big blinds can really call a lot because of the squeezes behind. Similar concepts that we saw before. Small blind calls fairly wide himself, can see suited stuff, and also just gets to 3-bet and get it in a lot because he's out of position. Another thing that we see fairly often is this kind of linear kind of 3-betting. So we can see the small blind just wants to 3-bet call like king 9 suited and some 10-9 suited and all these low suited aces. Because the idea here is that we fold some hand, we fold like ace jack off, king queen off, and when we get it in, fine, he just has to call off. So the 3-betting range isn't polar here, just very linear and includes a lot of suited aces. As for the hijack, when the hijack 3-bets these suited aces and it falls to us, we again fold with like king queen off, ace jack off, and when we jam, there are just pretty much no folds from the hijack. So again, we see these kind of hands, they're not 3-bet folding, they are 3-bet calling. There are no 3-bet folds from the hijack. That's why we see this super wide calling range. The big blind against our open gets to defend a lot. Not really jam much, just defend a super, super wide kind of range. One more interesting thing would be, how do the ranges behind play against the hijack 3-bet? So these 108 big blind stack side 3-bets, how do the ranges behind play? Do we see any calls? How wide do they get to jam? So cutoff going again super, super tight as the short stack. The bottom gets to play very, very tight as well. The small blind, no, doesn't really get to do much calling, or doesn't even get to do much non-all-in for betting either, just wants to basically be jamming a lot. Or not a lot, but be jamming the continuing range. And same goes for the big blind. So even though we saw a lot of 3-bet calling in GPV, we don't see calling 3-bets in ICM. At least as the cover stack. Now, what if MP is the one that 3-bets instead? So we open, and then it's the 55 big blind stack that 3-bets. Does the big stack get to cold call against that? And the answer is yes, but not much. Just some 10s, jacks, king, queen suited, ace, queen suited, ace, jack suited kind of hands. And the 4-bets are going to be value range and then some suited kings. Why do we prefer suited kings over suited aces? Well, if we look at the low jacks 3-bet range, it's value and then it's suited aces. So we don't want to be blocking the bluffs. We don't want to be blocking suited aces. That's why hijack prefers suited kings and just folds aces. Well, not pocket aces, but like suited aces. Again, this just shows that we really need to be aware of the range we're up against in this situation. So at this spot, we need to know that the low jack is going to be 3-betting suited aces as a bluff. That's the weak part of his range. So we need to not be blocking that. When it falls back to us and we jam, again, MP is just not really folding anything. These suited aces are 3-bet calling, similar to what we saw from the hijack. Because they benefit from folding out like ace jack off, and then they just have enough equity to get it in when we end up jamming. And the final hand that I have is this one over here, which we actually saw in the beginning of the course. So we are on a final table. Yeah, shocking, I know. We are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 players left. We are one of the middle stacks with 19 big blinds, and we have one of the shorter stacks opening. This is a 320 buy-in. So a starting bounty here is 75. Our opponent has 1.86k, which if we divide by 75, we're actually going to let the calculator do that for us so that I don't screw it up. We have 1866 by 75 has about 25 starting bounties. The starting stack here was 50k, as we can see here. So here it will be worth about 22k. So we want to do 25 times 22, which we can again use our favorite calculator to do. 25 times 22. And we have a 550k worth of bounty. The big blind is 300. So even though it's the top bounty, it's just not worth much. It's only worth about 2 big blinds. This is very common in those larger field tournaments. For example, this one has about 580 players, where on final tables, even the largest bounties are worth almost nothing. So the bounty here, even though it's the top bounty, it's only worth less than 2 big blinds. So 2 questions. How wide is he opening? How wide are we jamming? And we can also have a look at how the stack size behind are supposed to play. Okay, here it is. So hijack under the gun is supposed to be opening a very tight kind of range, only 16.7%, which again makes sense. He's the shortest stack with the biggest bounty, so even though it's not worth much, he still has to be very, very tight. Or well, not the shortest stack, but the second shortest stack. Against the open, we have a few reoccurring concepts of PKO final tables where the first player to act, Cutoff, who is also a stack covered by 2 of the 3 players behind, has no jumps and only plays 3 bets. Again, this is a byproduct of the very tight opening range and the Cutoff being covered by 2 ranges behind, so only gets to play 3 bets. The button has some calls and has some jumps and doesn't really 3-bet too much. Overall, the calls will be strong suited stuff and pocket pairs. The jumps will be suited broadways and, well, better pocket pairs, as well as some ace-queen off. And the non-rolling 3-bets will be top range, as well as some low-suited aces and ace-x off, king-x off kind of hands. Also king-8 suited, queen-8 suited. Again, the strongest hands that we cannot profitably call. So you can see king-9 suited is a profitable call, so it calls. King-8 suited is not a profitable call, so it 3-bets. Small blind, jumps only. And then for us in the big blind, we get to play like this. So not much jumps, calling very wide, at least with the suited stuff, and jamming like good suited broadways and pocket pairs. We don't jam offsuit ace-x, besides like ace-queen. We don't jam king-queen off. Even though it is a profitable jam, you can see it makes 156. Calling is much more profitable. And for non-rolling 3-bets, we have jacks plus for value ace-king, ace-queen suited, and then some offsuit ace-x primarily as the bluffing area. Now, if we jam, under the gun is calling 8 plus, ace-x suited, ace-queen off, seems reasonable. Against a 3-bet, let's say the Cutoff 3-betting, who is the position with the most 3-bets, then hijack gets to play like this. So jumps a fairly strong linear range, not playing super tight. And also one thing that we see differently here is that the jamming range is much more linear. So we see jumps with like 9s, but we don't see jumps with ace-5 suited. In normal tournaments, we know this works the other way around. We want to be folding more with pocket pairs, and we want to be jamming more with the blockers. Here, because the 3-bet calling range is just wider and more linear, like we see 9s, ace-queen off, as the 3-bet call range, we want to jam linear as well. So I would say this is one of the biggest takeaways from this example. We saw it before as well, but here even more clearly, that in PSKOs, both the 3-bet ranges and the 4-bet ranges are very, very linear and not that blocker heavy. You can see Cutoff is 3-betting like ace-queen off, 3-bet call, but isn't 3-betting like the low-suited aces that much, which is what would happen in a non-PSKO tournament. Okay, and with that, I think we can wrap this chapter up. I think we saw quite a few different examples to highlight the main difference between a normal final table and a PSKO final table. For more on PSKO final tables, we will have the PSKO final table review with GraphQL a bit later on. So, yep, stay tuned for that.